If Bernd Rosemeyer had not existed, historian Anthony Pritchard believed the Nazi Party would have invented him. Tall, blond, strong, and domineering, Rosemeyer became the pride of Adolf Hitler's motorsport program and the epitome of its goals. The press couldn't get enough of him, hailing him a radiant boy and a bold fighter. Beautiful blonde Bernd, they would gush as they linked him to the true superiority of Aryan blood and praised his overt willingness to compete with a swastika armband, to attribute his success to the glory of his mother country. Rosemeyer burst onto the Grand Prix scene with Auto Union just a few years after the company brought together 4 automakers on the verge of bankruptcy in a last-ditch effort to avoid fading into obscurity. And instantly, Rosemeyer elevated the outfit to immortality. Of course, Auto Union was one of 2 German automakers heavily funded by Hitler as a covert way to bolster the country's weakened military. Building aircraft was illegal, but building a state-of-the-art racing machine with engines that could easily be installed in an aircraft? Europe never blinked an eye. Add in a superstar like Rosemeyer behind the wheel with his Grand Prix victories and his world speed records, and you had a potent recipe for the kind of rampant German pride that could be easily mobilized into the war effort. This week on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we are continuing our discussion of the Nazi Party's impact on the racing world. In the previous episode, we covered all things Mercedes, as well as the complex ways the Treaty of Versailles contributed to the vacuum of power that allowed genocidal Nazi ideals to flourish. In this episode, we'll turn our attention to Mercedes' rival, Auto Union, with an eye to ultimately pinpointing the exact ways these German Grand Prix teams directly contributed to the deadliest war in all of human history. Let's dig in.
Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.
Last week, we started our discussion talking about how the aftermath of World War I created conditions in which ideals like fascism could thrive, as well as how fascist politicians could utilize disciplines like motorsport and the automotive industry to build their platforms. Today, I want to stretch a bit further back in time to talk about the foundations of Germany's automotive industry as a whole, because I think it paints an evocative picture that further explains the frustrations resulting from the collapse of those industries. While it's kind of impossible to pinpoint any single founder of the automobile, there is a strong argument to be made that Germany created the technologies that allowed this to happen. In the late 1870s, pioneers Carl Benz and Nicholas Otto teamed up to develop the 4-stroke internal combustion engine. Later, Benz took that engine and fitted it to a horse carriage, creating one of the first examples of a self-propelled automobile. That vehicle was called the Benz Patent Motorwagen, and it went on sale in the summer of 1888, making Carl Benz and Germany the founders of the commercial automotive industry. Meanwhile, Benz's wife Bertha played a significant role in the firm. When her husband completed his first vehicle, Bertha took it for a long drive around the countryside. When she returned home, she provided suggestions to Carl about how he could improve his product, by perhaps adding a third gear to make it possible to climb hills, or brake pads to better help the car stop. It was Bertha Benz who completed the first long-distance automobile trip, which she did behind the wheel of Benz Patent Motorwagen No. 3. Now, when we say long distance here, we're not talking about hundreds or even thousands of miles. No, this was a 65-mile trip from Mannheim to Pforzheim, where Bertha Benz paid a visit to her mother. Along the way, she found fuel at local pharmacies and tinkered with the vehicle to make repairs or tweak things that she felt would make it easier for her to continue. The publicity sparked by that drive was stunning, and a demand for these early vehicles quickly outpaced the abilities of the Benz facilities. But Benz wasn't the only automaker at the time. Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler had independently crafted his own 4-stroke internal combustion engine, and in 1887 set up his own company, Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft. Before long, this new invention was taking the world by storm, with automakers setting up shop in France, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, and even Australia, though it was Germany that ultimately dominated in terms of production numbers. But what was it exactly that made Germany such a hotbed of innovation? The late 19th century brought with it a rapid industrialization all around the world, but in Germany in particular, a set of complex inheritance laws started to subdivide once thriving family farms into ever-shrinking parcels that by this point could no longer be used to actually make a living. Add that with a sharp spike in population growth that led to a massive influx of craftsmen trying to stand out in an ever-muddying landscape, and a growing emphasis on industries surrounding railroads, mining, and metalworking, and you ended up with a population of tinkerers that had moved away from things like textiles and were now instead learning how to craft more complex machinery. This was a fruitful time of invention all around the world, and other countries like France, Italy, and America began to build from the early examples set by Germany. That being said, the German auto industry was still quite small up through the late 1930s. Even though they began to adopt principles of mass production similar to what had been introduced by Ford in the United States, the market for automobiles was still pretty small, particularly after the devastation of World War I left so many industries struggling to survive. It's here that I want to introduce us to the second automaker that plays a key role in the development of the Nazi racing scene, Auto Union. Founded in 1932, Auto Union was a merger of 4 automobile manufacturers in Germany that effectively centralized development amongst themselves. Those automakers were Audi, Wanderer, DKW, and Horch. All 4 of those companies had ties to one another well before they actually merged. In 1899, August Horch, a pioneer of German automotive engineering who had honed his craft at the Carl Benz Company, founded his own brand, a Horch & Company. Horch ultimately left that company in 1909 thanks to a difference of opinion with the other company heads. Knowing he had a future in the automotive world, he wanted to found another company, this one named Audi. So Horch continued on as its own brand, while August Horch created a new brand. Wanderer started life as a bicycle manufacturing company founded in 1896 by Johann Baptist Finkelhofer and Richard Adolf Jennecke. Naturally, as combustion engines became more prominent, their operation evolved from bicycles to motorcycles and then to four-wheeled automobiles. Things took a turn during the Great Depression. In 1929, Wanderer's owner was the Dresdner Bank. To recoup some of its losses, it sold off the motorcycle arm of Wanderer, then held on to the automobile arm for a few years until the Auto Union merger took place. That leaves us with DKW, which is short for Dampkraftwagen, which translates roughly to steam-powered car. In 1916, Danish engineer Jürgen Skefter Rasmussen founded a company in Germany that he used to produce steam fittings, which almost immediately resulted in him trying to build a steam-powered car. When that turned out to be a failure, Rasmussen moved on to building a toy two-stroke engine, which he later modified to power motorcycles. Automobiles came shortly after, though ongoing economic issues in Germany meant DKW needed to merge to survive. At the time of the merger, all 4 companies had been forced onto the brink of bankruptcy or had been tasked with significant restructuring in ways that would have made it completely unprofitable to continue building cars. By uniting forces, though, those 4 automakers could continue to thrive. That's because even though all 4 brands could develop and sell their own cars under their own names, much of the technological development being done took place collectively. It made sense. The 4 brands, represented by one of the 4 rings in the contemporary Audi logo, all took a different sector of the automotive market and made it their focus. DKW built motorcycles and small cars. Wanderer made medium-sized cars. Audi built cars in the upper mid-size auto segment, while Horch was the full-on luxury brand. All of these brands could pool their resources to help evolve their products, and they would all benefit. Most of these brands also had some kind of motorsport background because racing was a really convenient way to get your vehicle's name out there, and because it served as a really easy way to also measure your technology up against the latest and greatest from other makers. August Horch was part of the early turn-of-the-century racing scene, taking his first win in 1906 with the Horch Company. However, it was over racing that he and his board members butted heads, and when Horch left to found Audi, that brand became a huge success in motorsport, particularly in the long-distance rally. Between 1912 and 1914, Audi won 11 victories in 3 editions of the International Austrian Alpine Rally, and as a result, the Alpine Challenge Cup. DKW, meanwhile, was somewhat involved in motorsport starting in 1929, but not quite to the extent that it would be when it joined forces with the 3 automakers a few years later. The auto union merger came just in time for the 1933 Berlin Motor Show, where Adolf Hitler announced his state-sponsored motorsport program. Auto union wanted to make a splash on the international scene, to make its name known far and wide, and what better way to do that than by embarking on this automotive development program? The timing worked out quite well nevertheless, because just after those 4 brands united in 1932, the chairman of the board of directors, Baron Klaus von Ortzen, wanted a showpiece. He wanted to manufacture a car that would impress and that would announce auto union to the world in a big way. Fellow board member Adolf Rosemeyer had a particular man in mind to design this new stunning car, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche. Porsche had been working in the automotive industry since the late 1800s until he was drafted into military service in 1902, where he served as none other than a chauffeur for Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Porsche had nothing to do with the assassination because by that time he'd been hired by Austro-Daimler, a subsidiary of the Daimler Company. He worked his way up the ranks, only to leave for Steyr Automobile as Daimler merged with Benz. While the Daimler board liked Porsche's ideas, the folks from Benz were a lot less enthused. Porsche left of his own accord, but he was almost immediately made redundant due to the Great Depression. In 1931, Porsche founded his eponymous company, but commissions were low, and his decision to form a whole subsidiary company to develop racing machines that no one was buying didn't help anything. When Baron von Ortzen came calling at Rosenberger's request, Porsche answered. Rosenberger had helped Porsche found his self-named company, and he was integral in negotiating the auto union merger, then in helping set the tone for its racing program thanks to his background in motorsport. But as the name might suggest, Rosenberger didn't last long at auto union. A Jewish man, he was arrested for Rassenschande, which forbade Jews from having romantic and sexual relationships with Aryans, or so-called ethnic Germans. Rosenberger was imprisoned, but thanks to his connections in the automotive world, a colleague paid off Gestapo agents to turn the other cheek as Rosenberger escaped. He was forced to leave Germany immediately, first fleeing to France and then to England to serve as a Porsche representative. But in 1939, when the war officially broke out, he fled to the United States. I'm noting this particularly because Auto Union's goal here was to enter motorsport, and because Germany's goal was to represent itself in the best possible way on the international racing scene. Rosenberger had been integral to Germany's automotive and motorsport scenes, but he was Jewish. It was clear that motorsport was only a means to an end for new Chancellor Adolf Hitler, and Rosenberger was a near-instant victim. But let's move back to the 1933 Berlin Motor Show, where Hitler announced 2 programs. The first is the state-sponsored motorsport program, where the intention was to provide Mercedes-Benz with government money to go racing. The second was something named the People's Car, which would later be called the KDF-Wagen or the Volkswagen. Both will become integral to the history of auto union. If the German government intended to fund German automakers to dominate the international motorsport racing scene, Auto Union wanted in. Auto Union didn't quite have the sway with Hitler that Daimler-Benz did at the time, but it did have one way into his inner circle: Hans Stuck. Stuck started racing in 1922 when he found that he really enjoyed trying to best the time it took him to make his daily milk runs from his farm to Munich. It was off to hill climbing and Grand Prix racing, where he struck up a relationship with Mercedes, but ultimately Stuck was unable to secure an official race seat with the team. Most importantly, though, he knew Adolf Hitler. In 1925, the two men had struck up a casual friendship during a hunting trip, and they'd remained in contact ever since. Auto Union had Porsche designing a race car, and it had high aspirations, but if it wanted to make a strong case to Hitler, then it also needed to prove it had a capable racing driver in the mix. Hans Stuck was just that man. Later, he would nearly be removed from Auto Union because he had married tennis star Paula von Resnick, whose grandfather was Jewish. Only his friendship with Hitler would save his career and his life. Adolf Rosenberger, Baron Klaus von Oertzen, Ferdinand Porsche, and Hans Stuck all attended a meeting at the Reich Chancellery to make their case that if Germany really wanted to be great, then it shouldn't limit its chances on the Grand Prix circuit by funding just one automaker. In fact, a little homegrown competition could only be a good thing, pushing German motorsport to ascend to ever higher levels. Hitler agreed, and rather than pay the full 5,000 Reichsmarks to Mercedes, he agreed to split that sum between Mercedes and Auto Union, with a promise of a 500,000 mark bonus for the team that produced the best car in 1934. The battle was on. Mercedes-Benz had been developing its W25, which would be revolutionary, but Auto Union had plans of its own for how it intended to transform the Grand Prix scene. Ferdinand Porsche had been hard at work on something called the P-Wagen. This machine boasted a monstrous, supercharged V16 engine, but radically, it was a rear-engine machine. Normally, all the credit goes to Cooper for developing the first rear-engine Grand Prix machine after World War II, but Auto Union had tucked its power plant behind the driver in a radical departure from what the racing world had expected decades before. But why opt for a V16? It partially came down to packaging and partially to Auto Union hoping to avoid high RPMs. The V16 had a 45-degree V angle with small bore sizes, so even though this bad boy had 16 cylinders, it was surprisingly narrow and short and could fit easily within the mandated cockpit size. Plus, keeping RPMs down meant that Auto Union could completely avoid using what Motorsport magazine describes as, quote, heavy and complex dual overhead cams. Built of extremely lightweight materials, the initial engine produced 295 brake horsepower and, critically, could be enlarged later for even more power. The initial design was radical, but when it hit the racetrack for the first time in 1934, its early drawbacks were apparent. At that time, body-on-frame or ladder chassis were the de facto base upon which cars were built. For the average consumer car, that was fine. It provided a certain stiffness that could hold up to rutted roads, but no one was going fast enough to face any serious issues with that setup. Plus, those consumer cars were all front-engine, so everyone knew how the front-mounted engine impacted the overall dynamics of a car. Move the engine to the rear, and you've just completely altered the weight distribution, meaning that the required turning angle was drastically different between a front and rear engine car in any given corner. If you drove this Auto Union in the same way you drove a front engine car, you would suffer from a hell of a lot of oversteer. Another issue? Auto Union was a little perplexed in the testing department. While Mercedes would later go on to hire Rudolf Uhlenlaut to field its racing program thanks to both his design expertise and his ability to physically test the cars himself in order to channel feedback right into actionable changes, Auto Union never quite had the same advantage. It basically invented some early in-car data collection systems to use during testing sessions, but those systems were very rudimentary. The marque whipped up a clockwork mechanism and a paper disc that would record engine revs during testing. Those paper discs would later be handed off to engineers to study back at the factory, at which point they'd need to then divine possible mechanical tweaks based on what they saw. That was a slower development process, and that was pretty clear throughout the 1934 racing season. In the 6-race Grand Prix schedule, Auto Union managed to win just one event with its P-Wagen project, which had officially been named the Type A. The Alfa Romeo Tipo B machines run by Scuderia Ferrari kicked off the season with back-to-back victories at Monaco and Montlhéry, after which point Hans Stuck took home victory at the Nürburgring. The Belgian Grand Prix at Spa went to René Dreyfus in a Bugatti Type 59, while the Grand Prix of Italy and Spain went to Rudi Caracciola and Luigi Fagioli in the Mercedes-Benz W25. A challenging start to its racing program, yes, but Auto Union had an ace up its sleeve, and heading into 1935, the automaker knew it was time to play it. Born on October 14, 1909, Bernd Rosemeyer was exactly the kind of racing driver the Nazi Party had hoped for. Blond, tall, and avidly devoted to the Third Reich, Rosemeyer mesmerized anyone who had the privilege of seeing him race, particularly when it became clear that his racing skill was natural and not learned. In a quiet town of Lingen, Rosemeyer's father owned a motorcycle and automobile repair shop. As the elder Rosemeyer pulled cars apart and pieced them back together with precision, he did so with an audience of one, his young son Bernd. As soon as the boy could crawl on his own, he was something of a permanent fixture in the shop, peppering his father with questions and begging to drive one of the complex machines his father could master with ease. Rosemeyer was only 9 years old when he finally convinced his parents to let him have a go. They strapped wooden blocks to the pedals of the car in the shop so that he could reach the pedals, and then sent him on his way. Just like that, a legend was born. As a teenager, Rosemeyer saved up his pocket change to buy his first motorcycle, a 200cc DKW. On 2 wheels, he was a menace, speeding through the roads of his Hanover home with such abandon that the police were forced to revoke his license. Before long, he was heading to the local racecourses to get his speed fix, always on 2 wheels. In fact, he even once wrote, "Just as a bird needs the air and a fish needs the water, so Bernd Rosemeyer needs his motorbike." His daring exploits caught the eye of Auto Union, and in the spring of 1934, when Rosemeyer was just 24 years old, the outfit signed him to its motorcycle team. He was so successful that in the fall, they invited him to test their 4-wheeled race car. Thanks to its rear-engine layout, the original Auto Unions had a tendency to catch out some of the more inexperienced Grand Prix drivers because the balance was unlike anything they were used to. In order to be competitive, they basically had to relearn their driving style. But because Rosemeyer's experience was wholly confined to 2 wheels, he had no preconceptions about how a race car should handle its speed. He was able to develop his style behind the wheel of that exact car. Certainly no one, even Tazio Nuvolari, drove an Auto Union like Rosemeyer did, René Dreyfus, a fellow Grand Prix competitor at the time, recalled. Some people said that because he never drove anything else, it was easier for him to adapt to a rear-engine car. He had nothing to unlearn, if you like. That might have been true, but I would say he was faster than anyone. At that autumn test, Rosemeyer turned up decked out in his racing leathers, ready to make an impression, and that's exactly what he did. When the sun set on the test day, Rosemeyer had set the second fastest time, usurping even some of the team's most experienced racers. Auto Union knew it wanted to sign Rosemeyer to join its Grand Prix lineup for 1935, and it received the official sign-off from Adolf Hitler, who needed to approve every driver joining one of his German Grand Prix outfits. While racing motorcycles, Rosemeyer had insisted upon donning a swastika armband. He had willingly joined the SS and the National Socialist Motor Corps. While drivers like Rudi Caracciola seemed in need of convincing to adopt the ideals of the Nazi Party, Bernd Rosemeyer was the living embodiment of them. Heading into 1935, the second season with the 750-kilogram regulatory set, Auto Union had a strong driver lineup. Alongside Rosemeyer was Hans Stuck, the legendary Achille Varzi, and Paul Pietsch powering the Auto Union Type B in major competitions. But it had taken months to arrive at that potential lineup, with many of the team's previous drivers leaving motorsport behind. Prins von Leiningen, for example, retired with kidney problems, while August Momberger's arthritis and his personality clashes with team manager Willy Walb saw him step away too. Wilhelm Sebastian admitted that he just didn't feel confident driving such a powerful car, and Tazio Nuvolari, who was desperate for a drive, was turned away because the other drivers didn't want to compete alongside him. Auto Union skipped the season opener at the Monaco Grand Prix to go all out for the second race, which took place in Germany at Avis, but the season never quite shaped up in the team's favor. Hans Stuck took the team's only win at a major Grand Prix that year, at the Italian Grand Prix, while Achille Varzi won the Tunis Grand Prix and the Coppa Acerbo. Rosemeyer too snatched his first major victory at the Czech Grand Prix, and it was one that was destined to change his life. He had won, yes, but at the after-party, he ran into a woman named Ellie Beinhorn. Beinhorn, a renowned aviatrix, was in Brno to give a talk about her latest exploits and decided to stop by the Grand Prix after-party to see if she could chat with some drivers. There, she met a man 2 years her junior named Bernd Rosemeyer, and the two wasted no time getting engaged, with the press fawning over their high-speed love affair that simply proved the superiority of their so-called Aryan blood. The two scheduled their wedding for the summer of 1936, a year that overall was to prove an exceptional one for Auto Union. That season, Rosemeyer rejoined Varzi and Stuck at the German outfit, which had also signed Ernst von Delius and Rudolf Hasse to field its latest Type C race machines. Lengthened by 4 inches and boosted to 520 brake horsepower, handling had been greatly improved with a new limited slip differential and a torsion bar suspension. The 1936 Monaco Grand Prix kicked off the year with a Mercedes-Benz win courtesy of Rudi Cracciola, but that would be Cracciola's final win of the season. As one half of the Silver Arrows pairing lagged behind, another emerged to take its place: Auto Union. It was at the Nürburgring that June that Bernd Rosemeyer decisively launched his way into the motorsport history books. A thick fog had settled over the twisting circuit, obscuring visibility to just a few feet in front of you. It was enough to decipher the next corner before it completely took you by surprise, but still exceptionally challenging for any driver careening through that fog at over 100 miles per hour. The competition slowed down, treading with care, but Rosemeyer never thought to lift off the throttle. He rocketed to the finish line well before anyone else, and his autocar reported, "No one can see the approach of the cars. The staccato bark of the Auto Union is heard at last, and the crowd cheers Rosemeyer to the echo." The press dubbed him Der Nebelmeister, the Fog Master. A break in the action hit for the 1936 Summer Olympics, hosted in Berlin and designed to paint a favorable portrait of the Third Reich. The soldiers patrolling the streets were allowed to wear plainclothes, while stores tucked away the signs that read "Jews and animals not allowed." As athletes, journalists, and spectators flooded in from around the world, they were, quote, witnessing the revival, the flowering, the new spirit, the unity, the steadfastness and magnificence, pacific too, of course, spirit of the Third Reich, which lovingly embraces the whole world. In reality, the heartwarming picture painted by the government was only a facade blanketing the real aims of the Reich, which nevertheless seeped through. Germany hailed its athletes as warriors for the country, who stood at the front lines of foreign policy. When an athlete won, they had done so not for themselves, but for the Third Reich, to prove the superiority of a country that many had foolishly passed off as being crushed after the Great War. When racing resumed after the conclusion of the Games, Mercedes-Benz withdrew. It saw the potential of the rear-engine auto unions, and it knew that its W25 had no shot at powering one of its drivers to a championship. Instead, it put its head down to begin preparing a car for 1937, hoping to entirely redefine it to make it more competitive. As such, the remainder of the 1936 season was positively dominated by Rosemeyer, with victories at the Swiss and Italian Grand Prix and the Coppa Acerbo. He was crowned European champion for 1936, even as his teammate Hans Stuck was followed by posters reading, "A Jewish slave, no start for Stuck," thanks to his wife's distant Jewish relatives. While Mercedes had focused on revitalizing its W25 ahead of 1937, Auto Union merely made a few tweaks to an already successful machine, expecting its driver lineup of Rosemeyer, Stuck, Luigi Fagioli, Ernst von Delius, and Rudolf Hasse to make a clean sweep of the season. Auto Union did manage to take a victory in a championship Grand Prix that year, the first one of the season at Spa. Rudolf Hasse was behind the wheel. But the remainder of the year was dominated by Mercedes-Benz, with Manfred von Brauchitsch winning at Monaco and Cracciola taking victory at the German, Swiss, and Italian Grand Prix. Cracciola was crowned European champion, while Rosemeyer could only content himself with wins in the non-championship races. But those races were admittedly quite a consolation, such as, for example, the Vanderbilt Cup. First established by William Kissam Vanderbilt II in 1904, it was designed as a way to encourage American automakers to start taking motorsport as seriously as the Europeans did, particularly because the competition in Europe had led to some pretty impressive improvements in technology. After initially falling by the wayside after the 1917 event, William Kissam Vanderbilt II's nephew, named George Washington Vanderbilt III, revived it as a 300-mile race around a newly built Roosevelt Raceway in Long Island in 1936. Just as in the past, winning the race would net a huge cash prize, which was a huge draw for the European drivers. The German manufacturers skipped the 1936 event, but both Mercedes and Auto Union turned up the following year in hopes of securing not just victory, but promoting the Silver Arrow's consumer cars to an even wider audience. In the United States, as in Germany, Bernd Rosemeyer was a media darling, with columnist Bill Corum writing, "This Rosemeyer family is in a deuce of a hurry. He drives at almost 250 miles per hour on the Autobahn. She flies almost as quickly around the world. What will happen one day if they have a son? There will be nothing left for him but to visit Mars in a rocket." Rosemeyer and Cracciola initially battled for the lead, but it was the Auto Union driver who triumphed in what the New York Times hailed as the most spectacular automobile marathon ever witnessed in this country. When sending press releases back to Germany, the National Socialist Motor Corps head Adolf Hitler made sure to highlight how the Silver Arrow drivers showed, quote, impeccable order and discipline that left a lasting impression on the motor cowboy Americans, that their technology was superior to anything found in the United States, that swastika flags adorned the raceway for hours. What's more, there were allegedly reports of New Yorkers writing, "Show the Americans what German racing cars are," Heil Hitler, on a box of spare parts that the team had brought to the track. Back in Berlin, Bernd Rosemeyer was given a hero's welcome. He was promoted to SS captain and paraded through the streets, where massive crowds had gathered to celebrate the triumph. 1937 may not have been perfect for Auto Union, but it still had its moments. After several years of its seasons being resoundingly dominated by the German machinery, the Association Internationale des Automobiles Club Reconnus, the AIACR, which was a progenitor to the FIA, issued a brand new regulatory set coming into 1938 that was specifically designed to reduce the almighty dominance of the Silver Arrows. The previous regulatory set had been unable to curb the incredible speeds of German machines, and the French organization was determined to find some way to enable its homegrown manufacturers to sneak some Grand Prix victories. The new rules reduced the engine displacement, but even that was no match for the massive funding and ingenuity of the Germans. Heading into the year, Auto Union had replaced its V16 engine with a supercharged V12, but it insisted upon maintaining its rear engine layout because it had worked so well for them in the past. The team, though, had also gone through some significant personnel changes. Before the year, Ferdinand Porsche had left to focus on the Volkswagen project, though he also provided a lot of assistance to Mercedes-Benz. Hans Stuck was gone. He'd either been fired or he quit, depending on whose story you consult. And one other tragedy had brought auto union to its knees: the death of Bernd Rosemeyer. As I mentioned in the previous episode on Mercedes-Benz, Grand Prix racing wasn't the only form of automotive competition that Hitler hoped to dominate. He also wanted German cars to snatch land speed records from foreign automakers, and in January of 1938, a slew of record attempts were scheduled as a build-up to the Berlin Motor Show. Early in the morning of January 28, 1938, Rudi Cracciola snatched the land speed record from Rosemeyer, and Auto Union decided that it must respond immediately, before the next newspapers were sent to print declaring Mercedes-Benz victorious. As the team headed to the airfield beside a stretch of Autobahn near Frankfurt where the record run would take place, breeze had begun to kick up. Cracciola and Mercedes knew the best time to set their record would be in the early hours of the morning, when the weather was still and calm, and the conditions were perfect. But if Auto Union wanted that record back immediately, it didn't have the luxury of time. It would have to act immediately. Rosemeyer did not question the decision. He'd been desperate for a chance to set land speed records since he joined Auto Union, and he'd been granted his wish time and again. He would not allow Cracciola to snatch that away from him, not after he had been beaten so resoundingly by the Mercedes driver throughout the 1937 championship. Rosemeyer had 2 practice runs where his average speed over the mile topped 268 miles per hour, just a fraction slower than Cracciola's record-breaking run earlier that morning. Auto Union was convinced that Rosemeyer could shatter the record on the next go, and at 11:46 in the morning, his streamlined Auto Union rocketed into the distance. The stretch of Autobahn used for this record attempt was roughly 10 kilometers long, and Rosemeyer was positively screaming through each checkpoint. Until kilometer 9.2. Much of the roadway in question was lined with trees, which would shield cars from any gusts of wind. But near the very end of the road set aside for setting these records, there was a point where the trees disappeared. There, a gust of wind could easily buffet against the side of a car, and at such high speeds, it could spell disaster. And for Rosemeyer, it did. The exact cause of the crash is not clear. Some wonder if the wind had taken Rosemeyer by surprise. Others wondered if he'd adjusted his position on the road in anticipation of the wind and gotten it wrong. All we know is that Rosemeyer was traveling at over 250 miles per hour when his tire brushed the grass on the left side of the road, and that was it. The Auto Union began to slide and somersault, chucking gleaming shards of silver metal across the road surface. Rosemeyer himself was thrown from the cockpit, his body pitched over 80 yards into the woods. He was discovered sitting upright at an awkward angle against a tree trunk, eyes open, face serene. A deeper investigation into the crash may have unearthed its true cause, but the German government wasn't interested. The Third Reich declared nothing but, quote, "Fate took him from us." It wasn't Auto Union's fault, or Rosemeyer's, or the wind. It was simply a terrible tragedy, one that stole away, quote, "a soldier in the exercise of his duty." Ellie Beinhorn, Rosemeyer's widow, who had just given birth to their first child 10 weeks earlier, requested a quiet, apolitical funeral for none but close family and friends. Her request was denied. Joseph Goebbels could see the propaganda possibilities afforded by the death of a German hero, and he demanded Rosemeyer be given a dramatic state funeral. Fellow German drivers donned crisp white racing overalls and marched behind Rosemeyer's coffin en route to his resting place. SS officers lined that drive, with Hitler's personal staff accompanying Beinhorn to the gravesite. Some accounts suggest that she soon walked off, protesting the fact that her beloved husband's death had been snatched away from her to be used as fodder for the state. It's not clear if she truly did walk away, but the propaganda was effective. high-ranking Nazi officials mailed off 2 copies of their letters of condolence, one to Beinhorn and one to the press, which ran breathless coverage of Hitler's telegram that read, "The news of your husband's tragic fate has left me shaken. May the thought that he fell fighting for Germany's reputation lessen your great grief." All the while, photos and video footage of the mangled wreck dominated the papers and newsreels. Everywhere you looked was proof that Bernd Rosemeyer was a hero, one who had been snatched away too soon. It was with this weight on its shoulders that Auto Union approached the 1938 Grand Prix season. Tazio Nuvolari took the manufacturer's only 2 wins that year, one at the championship-eligible Italian Grand Prix, and another at the non-championship Donington Park Grand Prix. Mercedes dominated, and Rudi Cracchiola took another championship. But heading into 1939, it was clear that worsening political tensions were going to play a role in the season. Auto Union added twin superchargers to its D-type racer, and its road holding had improved immensely. Tazio Nuvolari was crowned team leader, while Hans Stuck, Rudolf Hasse, and Hermann Mueller rounded out the Grand Prix program. Around Europe, though, motorsport fell victim to the oncoming war. At the start of the season, Benito Mussolini forbade Italian drivers from competing in French events and then demanded that Italian races should be run for 1.5-liter cars only. The Monaco Grand Prix was cancelled, with organizers citing economic uncertainty, and British drivers were advised against traveling to Europe for fear that the sudden outbreak of war might trap them there. The final championship-eligible race of the season concluded on August 20th. Less than 2 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland, prompting England and France to declare war on the Third Reich. Racing crumbled, and World War II had begun. When the dust settled on World War II, Europe knew that it would have a significant uphill battle ahead of it when it came to restoring prosperity. As I noted in the last episode, Daimler-Benz had managed to stay afloat by using forced labor in its factories throughout the war, which had at that point been converted for military production. That enabled it to find a little more comfort as it eased into the post-war era. In 1945, Daimler-Benz was reduced to its 4 original southern German plants, along with 1 plant in Berlin. Those plants were converted into repair centers for U.S. military vehicles, while Nazi actors were scrubbed from upper management. On January 3, 1946, U.S. occupiers allowed Daimler to begin restoring its factories for consumer car production, and production resumed at all plants in 1947. By 1948, Daimler-Benz was recording massive profits thanks largely to Daimler's new commercial vehicle division and its contracts with Argentinian, Brazilian, and Indian governments to help industrialize those countries. So promising was its growth that in 1954, Mercedes-Benz returned to the international Grand Prix racing scene. Alfred Neubauer once again led that program, which fielded the stunningly advanced W196 and resulted in 2 of Juan Manuel Fangio's 5 Formula One World Driver Championships. However, as we've touched on before on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, the ingenuity of the Mercedes racing team led to the greatest tragedy in motorsport history. At the 1955 24 Hours of Le Mans, Mercedes driver Pierre Levesque was involved in an accident that launched his car into a spectator area, killing more than 80 viewers. The crash was exacerbated by the magnesium alloy bodywork on the car, which burst into ultra-hot flames that no one knew how to extinguish. Mercedes had already decided that it would step back from international racing at the conclusion of the year, but the Le Mans disaster only reaffirmed its decision to do so. Mercedes continued to flourish as a consumer and commercial car company through the following years, and it would finally return to Formula One as a works program in 2010 after Daimler purchased the Braun Grand Prix team. When the series introduced its hybrid V6 power unit regulations in 2014, Mercedes went on to dominate the next 8 years of the sport. But Auto Union didn't have quite the same comfortable fate. While the automaker did secure a certain amount of military contracts, just enough to sustain itself into World War II, it was not operating at anywhere near the same level as Daimler-Benz. It, too, utilized slave labor to build military machinery, and its manufacturing plants were heavily bombed by the Allies. But location played a primary role in the automakers' inability to recover after the war. Daimler was primarily located in American-controlled West Germany. Auto Union, though, was an East German company, and its facilities fell under the remit of the Soviet military. While the Americans had allowed Mercedes to retain its manufacturing plants, the Soviets had Auto Unions immediately dismantled. The company's assets were liquidated. The Horch and Audi plants in Zwickau became publicly owned enterprises, and after DKW sued the plant for building cars too similar to its own, those plants started manufacturing the Trabant. In 1949, Auto Union executives fled East Germany to set up a new version of the company in Ingolstadt. Of the 4 original brands, only DKW actually resumed production because no one could afford the luxury vehicles manufactured by Horch or Audi. In 1958, Daimler-Benz purchased an 87% stake of Auto Union and took control of the brand. But as the German economy began to pick up, Daimler was getting concerned that consumers were going to be interested in buying more expensive vehicles, not the simple 2-stroke engine-powered DKWs. Enter Volkswagen, which purchased both the Ingolstadt factory and the Auto Union trademark rights. After more mergers and acquisitions, the company we now know as Audi was created in 1969. It too made a bold return to motorsport, with big successes coming in rallying, DTM, and endurance racing. Now, heading into 2026, Audi will be making a big return to Formula One, taking over the current Sauber brand and building its own power units. When we look back on this era of government-funded Grand Prix racing, I think it's very easy to approach it as we do now, with the full context of history on our side. We can clearly see that Nazi investment in motorsport had a strong link to the evolution of the German military after World War I and in the build-up to World War II. We can see how it sowed in us-against-them nationalism in a country that had been so desperately lacking things to be proud of. We can see that investing in motorsport was also tied to investments in teaching average Germans how to drive and maintain cars, which were handy tools in the event of a military mobilization. But at that time, it was far less clear. In the early 1930s, when a driver of Jewish heritage named René Dreyfus moved to Italy to compete for Maserati, fascism had been establishing its roots. But to him, these soldiers were merely theatrical in their dress and pompous and buffoonish in their actions, even if they were friendly enough. He calls them harmless. He notes that a few years later, though, there was a nationalism growing that was not hospitable to a foreign presence. In 1939, during a trip to the Nürburgring, he says that the racing world was still warm and welcoming, that he had no problems crossing the border. Still, the track was laden in swastikas, and there were Nazi soldiers there in droves. War was present in the background of every interaction, but no one was willing to address it head-on. Yet not long after the German Grand Prix, Dreyfus headed to join the French army. For the drivers like Rudi Cracchiolo and Bernd Rosemeyer who were racing for German teams, who joined the National Socialist Motor Corps, who were invited to private meetings with Adolf Hitler to celebrate their successes, there should absolutely be accountability, yes. These were men who could more clearly see the way their actions were shaping the war effort. They almost certainly knew that the factories of the teams they raced for were also manufacturing aircraft and heavy trucks in preparation for a war that no one wanted to admit was coming. Some, like Rosemeyer, embraced that role. Others, like Cracchiolo, were concerned more about their racing careers and what were to happen to them if they were to suddenly defect from the outfit they'd been associated with their whole lives. But both men were critical tools in the crafting of Nazi propaganda. I think these 2 episodes should highlight a few different things. The first being the legitimate tactical importance motorsport had in revitalizing Germany. Yes, the Nazi government was quick to latch on to literally anything it could to promote the ideals of the Third Reich, but motorsport was a very convenient outlet. After the depression that followed the First World War, the German people had something to be proud of. Motorsport was bolstering industry and providing jobs to thousands of struggling people. It provided an outlet for the brightest technical minds in the country to craft jaw-droppingly beautiful and powerful Grand Prix cars. It was intimately intertwined with programs designed to get more German citizens into cars and to ensure their competence behind the wheel. It gave them a chance to absolutely crush the French and to assert their dominance on a world stage, even if it was just at racetracks. And those automotive manufacturing jobs led right into military manufacturing jobs. The Nazi Party was quick to promote anything German as being the absolute pinnacle of excellence, but it also understood how important it was to the average citizen to feel like they were playing a role in that too. But I think it raises a lot of uncomfortable questions about the responsibilities that these racing drivers had for their role in advancing harmful Nazi propaganda. It's really easy for us to look back and say, well, if Rudy Caracciola didn't actually support the racist and anti-Semitic ideals of the Nazi Party, then he shouldn't have allowed himself to be used as a propaganda tool. He should have stood up, said something, quit racing, changed teams, something. And yes, those were options. I also think that mindset fails to factor in the complexities of the situation. I don't mean to defend a lack of action or anything like that, but I want to highlight a phenomenon that a man named Peter Pomerantsev called the propaganda of unreality. This is a phenomenon where bombastic politicians arrive on the global stage promising a return to greatness for his country, revenge against his country's enemies, and new cars for all his country's citizens. If you have even a smidge of political understanding, you know that all of these claims are outrageous. They're founded on a nostalgia for a time that never existed, and they paint a picture of a future that is instinctually appealing, but also founded on absolutely nothing. As Pomerantsev writes, this approach to exerting mass influence is one that controls people not through insisting on a single truth they should adhere to, but that says instead that truth is unknowable. It's an approach that doesn't insist on an alternative reality, but on a morass of competing unrealities. So when we look back at the German drivers competing for Mercedes or Auto Union, we should keep in mind that they were existing in a world of unreality. The cruelties of the Third Reich seemed so far away and frankly unbelievable. Perhaps they would argue that the Jews being arrested by the Gestapo had committed some sort of crime and deserved it, or that the reports of uprisings around the country were overblown, or that Hitler's threats against the rest of Europe just simply wouldn't come true. It required you to choose a certain level of ignorance, yes. It's also very hard to imagine what those drivers could have personally done without risking death or imprisonment when the sole consuming factor of their life was driving cars on the limit. Again, I'm not going to excuse the horrors of the Third Reich or ignore the significant role that racing drivers played in building the Nazi propaganda machine. I'm only hoping to highlight the complexities of the situation so that ideally we can recognize these patterns in the pre-war racing world and see if we can spot any uncomfortable reflections in modern motorsport today. With politicians turning up at racetracks and prominent drivers paying visits to the White House, I think these conversations should be happening. All we can do now is study how similar situations played out in the past and see if we can't write a new future. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we're going to talk about NASCAR's brief and controversial experiments with unionization, which set the tone for how the sport would operate in the future. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack or my social media, where you can find plenty of fun facts about the history of racing or about what it takes to become a motorsport journalist in the year of our Lord 2025. If you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, or you just want to reach out, I have an email for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, I'm ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show, with the full list of them available in the description. My sources this week remain very much the same from those that I mentioned in the previous episode. Aside from some other historical resources, I turned my attention to some motorsport books that I love, like Faster, How a Jewish Driver, an American Heiress, and a Legendary Car Beat Hitler's Best by Neil Bascom, and A Race with Love and Death, the story of Britain's first great Grand Prix driver, Richard Seaman, by Richard Williams. They are both masterclasses in the art of narrative nonfiction, so if you enjoyed these last 2 episodes, you'll love both of these books. Thank you for joining me this week, and I'll see you for the next episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.